Despite the fact that I've only played through the Metro games a handful of times, I still think of them as being special. It could be because I was first introduced to Metro 2033 at a point in my life when things were changing, so Metro 2033 will always be tied to the memories I have of then. It's also because the Metro games simply deliver the goods in more ways than one. If you're familiar with the work that I've done over the last few years, you know that I'm a big sci-fi fan. Metro definitely does more than enough to be labeled as a sci-fi game, but it also combines multiple different narrative elements that take it to the next level. As a whole, I appreciate that these games have Russian audio tracks. I like to be exposed to different languages and cultures, so even if playing these games in Russian required more concentration, I liked how this contributed to the enjoyment I got from playing. What also stands out to me is the fact that this is more than just a post-apocalypse sci-fi FPS. There are multiple moments throughout these games in which paranormal and spiritual themes are covered. To some, that may come off as awkward or even out of place, but not to me. The inclusion of those themes makes it so that the Metro games are able to stand out from other FPS games. It was to the point where I kept expecting this to pop up whenever I was playing, and when that didn't happen to the degree that I was hoping for, or even at all, I was disappointed. It's easy for me to understand why a game would try to stray away from what could be seen as its mainstays. It's to avoid being pigeonholed, but also simply to try something new in order to be able to offer you a different experience. In some ways that's good, but when it comes to Metro Exodus, that left me feeling a bit disappointed and with the desire to revisit the earlier games. With what I just stated, you'd think that I didn't like this game, but that's not true. Metro Exodus delivers the goods in more ways than one, but as a result of wanting to offer more than what's been delivered in the past, what made Metro is kind of cast aside. This was mostly seen with how the majority of the game was an attempt to create an open world experience, which I'll eventually get into, but from the start, what really bugged me was how little control I had during certain cutscenes. I'm sure that it's because it was just the start of the game, but with how some of the cutscenes played out, it was as if you were a spectator rather than the one in control. I didn't like that because even if the cutscenes were entertaining to watch, the experience would have been even better had I been the one trying to combat a mutant or trying to escape from whichever situation I happen to be in. I realize that's too close to quick-time events, something which used to plague just about every game at one point in time, but as long as they're used sporadically and in appropriate moments, I'm all for it. For me, quick-time events aren't attempts at lazily adding in gameplay without making things more hands-on. It's a good mix of a visual experience as well as a hands-on one, much like Leon's knife fight with Krauser in Resident Evil 4. If this had only occurred a handful of times, I probably would have just marked it down as a nitpick and moved on, but the problem is that this happened more times than I would have liked. What was even more disappointing was realizing that what I had in mind was used, but at a much later point in Metro Exodus. Just towards the end of the game, you encountered these blind gorillas. Since this was a new enemy type and one that greatly differed from what you've previously experienced in the game, it's easy to understand why their introduction was made as big of a deal as it was. The difference between these cutscenes and the earlier ones was that you were in control here. It wasn't on the same level as how the rest of the game was played, but it was for sure better than being taken out of the moment. I know that not all games aim to have you feel as if you're in your character's shoes, but when it comes to an FPS, I'd say that's the difference between a good one and a great one. Don't get me wrong, I'm not setting this review up to make it so that my point is to trash Metro Exodus. There was plenty good in this game, and the bulk of the enjoyment I got from playing was thanks to the level of familiarity that it offered veteran players. For some, the point of playing a new entry in a game series is to try out new things. It's to compare what's new, what's been improved, and in some cases, what's worsened. Thankfully, I really didn't have any serious complaints when it comes to the weaponry that's offered in Metro Exodus. Much like in the previous two entries, the bulk of the weapons that are available to you are the same as what's been used before. As a result of that, I pretty much just stuck to the weapons that were available to me from the start. I knew that there were multiple options to choose from, seeing as how you could easily pick up enemy weapons, which helped get you to try something new, but I prefer to stick to the automatic rifle, the pneumatic rifle, and the silenced revolver. In the eyes of some, my weapons loadout involved me playing it safe, but my point was to try to have a balanced loadout. With the weapons that I had on hand, I could easily go from short, mid, or long-range combat without having to improvise during hectic moments. At times I thought of changing things up, mainly because I wanted to see more of what Metro Exodus had to offer, but I really didn't see the point. That was mostly because I frequently upgraded the weapons that I had. Even if these upgrades didn't drastically change how the weapons could be utilized, The upgrades made it so that the changes were noticeable and worth utilizing. I also appreciated the visual aspect that went hand in hand with the weapon upgrades. Seeing as how Metro as a series heavily leans upon steampunk in all sorts of ways, it makes sense that this would also be seen in the weaponry that's available to you. It's not only because these makeshift weapons have more character than if they were pristine and straight out of, say, a Call of Duty game, but also because it fits into the overall environment that the Metro series takes place in. It's a small detail, but including this as you were making upgrades made it so that this activity wasn't as mundane as it can sometimes be in lesser quality games. Despite generally sticking to 3 main weapons for the majority of the game, at one point I had to rely on the shotgun because of the situation I happened to find myself in. It was during that moment that I realized how the shotgun was great in more ways than one. With how most combat scenarios play out in Metro Exodus, it's clear that you're much better off sticking to quieter weapons, but when the right moment popped up, the shotgun was a real joy to use. For me, the enjoyment I got from using the shotgun was mainly because it looked like something straight out of Doom. It looked different from the rest of the weapons that I encountered throughout the game, and I liked that. One nitpick I do have in regards to the shotgun is that I would have liked to have seen more gore as a result of using it. Metro is the kind of series that's disturbing as a result of its subject matters, but with a visually stunning game such as this one, this is a small detail that would have elevated my overall experience, even if just a bit more. You'd think that it's a good thing that the Metro series approaches situations that are seen in other games in a different manner, but sometimes that left me bummed out. For the most part, I was satisfied with what the combat in this game had to offer, but I thought that the horde moments could have been better than they were. It's because these are the moments where you feel it's most appropriate to go all out in an attempt to prevent being overrun by whichever enemies you happen to be dealing with. Instead, ammo was limited, so that led to me feeling stifled. I realize that the point of this is to add a degree of realism, much like the use of masks and filters to prevent radiation sickness, but sometimes I want games to be games. Strict adherence to realism can sometimes be fun, and I wouldn't say that's how Metro Exodus was approached, but these situations were where I felt it would have been most appropriate to really go all out. It's because I spent a great deal of the game trying to play as stealthily as possible and not killing enemies. I tried my best to maintain that playstyle, but seeing as how I'd eventually get the bad ending, something I intend to get into, you could say that I didn't do as good of a job as I could have. I realize that it's more due to the fact that my experiences with similar games have left me with the idea that all games should work in such a way, but it's because that's what you come to expect. What I'm getting at is that Fallout and other similar games have gotten me used to the idea of not being able to wait or rest while enemies are nearby. It could be that I just wasn't as close as I needed to be in order for this to take place, but I was surprised to see that you could go to sleep while close to enemies. I thought that was strange because it affected how combat played out. What I mean is that rather than feeling forced to stand my ground and either deal with the situation or die, I could sometimes run to the nearest shelter, go to sleep, and things would be better at a later time. This isn't something to turn into a big deal, but I could see others being bothered by this. Another similar issue that I noticed was how you'd take damage after jumping down a fairly small distance. It's easy to understand why fall damage is a thing, seeing as how you're playing as a regular person, but at the same time, I felt that it leaned too far into a place where it wasn't realistic at all. Moments such as this one are small details when compared to some of the bigger issues I had with Metro Exodus, but I bring them up because they eventually add up, and they take me out of the immersion the game is capable of creating throughout its story. With how this fall damage would occur as a result of jumping from small distances, I thought that there was an imbalance between going too far with what was allowed or disallowed. On one hand, you could cheaply evade enemies by running into shelter and going to sleep, but on the other hand, you couldn't jump a few feet or else you'd take damage. This was most noticeable when I was running away from enemies, and it made things worse for me. On top of having to avoid either bullets or attacks from winged demons, I also had to be aware of something as mundane as jumping from places that weren't high at all. One thing I'll eventually get around to fully discussing within this review is the idea that some of the issues I have with Metro Exodus is due to it wanting to expand and do more than what was initially done with the first 2 Metro games. It's easy to understand why that'd be done, but what kept me playing was seeing how much it was still like the previous entries. It's nothing new, but I liked being able to choose between being stealthy or going all out. It was especially interesting when I could take advantage of whichever environment I was in to evade combat. Early on, this was doable thanks to being able to climb onto pipes and walking over enemies. I realized that there are great differences between both games, but the ability to do this reminded me of Dishonored. It's because there are more options for you to choose from when compared to the previous games. In those games you could choose between being stealthy or going all out, but there were still restrictions. It's not as if you could choose one environment over another. It was either try to take the stealthy approach on a bridge or take the enemies out in a blaze of glory while being on the same bridge. This was better seen in later parts of Metro Exodus, but I still enjoyed being able to indirectly avoid combat rather than having to be up close and personal while attempting to avoid encounters. Frankly, I was never really a big fan of the stealth portions of this series. It's because I feel as if it created a clash between who Artyom is as a character and his position as a ranger, but also because I was more into the more straightforward enemy encounters with mutants in the Metro or outside. It's not that I didn't enjoy having to think up strategies to avoid combat with human enemies, but that wasn't as fun as being face to face with multiple mutants at once. I say that, and yet Metro Exodus surprised me by how close it allowed me to get to a mutant nest. You'd think that the mutations would make it so that these enemies would have heightened senses or something, but that wasn't the case. At one point I managed to sneak into a mutant nest and headshot all of them in their sleep. You could say that goes against my preferred way of approaching combat, but if the odds are stacked against me, I'm willing to resort to different tactics that'll bring me the results I want. Even if there were plenty of moments where I was frustrated with Metro Exodus, there was also a lot that left me thinking that a great deal of attention to detail went into making this game. In the same way that I bring up small details that detract from my experience with this game, it's also worth mentioning the little things that add to it. While Metro Exodus isn't as gory as other games, I enjoyed when blood/carnage went onto your mask. It added something else to have in mind as you were in the middle of combat, as troublesome as that could sometimes be, but it also added to the game's immersion. I know that I'm playing a game, but if you can create an experience that can get me to relate to what my character is experiencing, that's a good thing. Wiping away blood from Artyom's mask made his situation even more real than if this small part of the game wasn't present. It's kind of how your heart thumping is audible after running for a while. Early on in the game, I was actually frightened when I heard that sound because it managed to catch me by surprise, but it also sounded like a demon's flapping wings. It's possible that this isn't what the devs had in mind, but I like it when little tricks like that are played on you. It's an indirect way of telling you to stay on your toes because you never know when something can catch you off guard, even if it's something that won't harm you. The point is to add more details to the game and make it as memorable as possible. Something else I liked about Metro Exodus combat is that it made your actions matter by leaving behind a mess once you were done with an enemy encounter. In particular, I liked how enemies would end up being burnt to a crisp after using a Molotov cocktail. Not only was that a sick visual, it made it clear that you were using a weapon that most likely caused your enemy a great deal of pain. I'm not the kind of player that'll take sympathy on my enemies in game, at least not on a regular basis, but if I'm already stuck in a precarious situation and being as brutal as possible is the best way to survive, that's most likely what I'll resort to. If you've watched or read enough of my reviews, you're probably aware of the fact that I like to use everything that's made available to me to try to get ahead. Some would categorize that as cheap, cheesy, or even cheating, but I figure that if it's doable in the base version of the game, it's all good. One thing I liked was being able to take out enemies through iron grates. Much like some other things that stood out to me, this was a small detail, but I like this because other games would have made it so that this wasn't possible. It could be that those games just simply didn't have the technology or know how to make this doable, but I was still pleasantly surprised to notice that not only could I take out enemies from a fair distance, I could also do so while having some sort of barrier separating me from whichever enemy I happen to be dealing with. When a game decides to change things up, it's normal for fans that have been around since the beginning to not be fully receptive to this. The saying different strokes for different folks comes to mind, but in my case, I wasn't completely satisfied with Metro Exodus moving into a more open world. I was pretty early into my time with Metro Exodus, and yet I was thinking that I definitely preferred playing it as one of the previous Metro games instead of as an open world one. What I mean is that I didn't fully embrace the open world nature of Metro Exodus. The very fact that I could do this makes it so that Metro Exodus really isn't as open world as other open world games out there, but I guess that's up to you to decide how open an open world game needs to be in order to be categorized as one. Since it's clear that Metro Exodus was moving on from the more linear format seen in the earlier entries, I'll keep referring to Metro Exodus as an open world game. Honestly, I was disappointed with how big the map appeared to be, only to realize that besides finding different shelters, I had yet to find something noteworthy. It could be that I was expecting Metro Exodus to be more like Fallout, so when I saw that its side content wasn't as rewarding as I thought it'd be, that bummed me out. Not only that, I didn't feel inclined to keep giving it a try. If something was along the way and I happened to be in a new area, I'd go check things out, but sometimes all I'd get as a reward for exploring was a note or extra supplies. That's nice, but at the same time, this left me thinking that the chase was better than the catch. It could just be that my expectations for this game were too high, seeing as how I came into it as a fan of the series, and you could also say that the initial marketing worked against me. From what I recall, a great deal of attention was brought to the fact that the majority of Metro Exodus would take place outside of the subway tunnels. It also didn't help that its announcement focused on how it featured exploration and one of the most immersive game worlds ever created, as directly quoted from one of its trailers. I'm probably coming down on Metro Exodus a bit too hard and making it seem as if I didn't enjoy it at all, but that's not true. I guess the best way to put it was that my expectations weren't fully met. I want to say that Metro Exodus wasn't as open world as I thought it'd be, but at the same time, there was plenty about its level design that left me satisfied. It was somewhere towards the later parts of the game where I ended up washing up onto a village. Its early areas were nothing to write home about, but it was once I got further into the village and started to encounter enemies that I was happy with what I got to experience. What I mean is that rather than attempting to go in guns blazing or silently taking out enemies, I hopped over a fence and went down to the riverbank. As a result of that, I snuck past most of the enemy patrols. I liked that because it was an example of what I like to experience in games: availability of multiple options or pathways. The village would eventually appeal even more to me, mostly due to a wrecked building offering you a vertical vantage point from which to pick off enemies. In regards to what that had to offer when it comes to gameplay, I thought that was great. When it came to offering something extra as a result of exploring an optional path, I was disappointed due to simply finding a note. I've pretty much made it clear that I wasn't happy with how Metro Exodus had more to offer on the open world side of things. While that's true, the change in environments was nice. I feel conflicted over this because on one hand, I want more of what made the first two Metro games great, but on the other hand, I'm aware of the fact that repeating the same old thing over and over again will just lead to stagnation, and that'll cause your game to suffer in more ways than one. I think that there could have been a better way of combining the new with the old in such a way that I, along with other similar-minded players, could be better satisfied. The vast landscapes offered in some areas made it so that Metro Exodus was fleshed out in ways that the first two weren't, but it wasn't enough for me. It's kind of how some games will brag about how large their in-game worlds are, and they'll bring up ridiculous numbers such as, "It'd take weeks to walk across our map in real life," but at the end of the day, that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is quality content that makes me feel engaged and satisfied with what's being offered to me. When I noticed things picking up and moving on from what was initially offered, I was happy. It was in the bunker full of cannibals that I started to feel the same levels of excitement that I initially felt when playing through Metro 2033 and Last Light. It wouldn't be the last time I felt that way, and that helped redeem Metro Exodus. While it's true that it's difficult to categorize a game as perfect, at the very least it has to be playable to such a degree that no obstacles, whether they be bugs, crashes, or freezes, get in the way of you advancing through it. Unfortunately, I had these very issues with Metro Exodus to the point where it made me think less of the game. I could be playing a game that combines the greatest narrative and gameplay, but if it's regularly crashing, freezing, or acting up in noticeable ways, my excitement for it will diminish the more I experience this. I don't know if it's because I played on high settings or what, but I had to deal with multiple crashes throughout different parts of the game. On top of that, my PC would automatically restart itself during a play session. I'm sure that some may be thinking, well, that could just be a scheduled update or a restart taking place while you were playing, but that wasn't the case. What could be further pinpointed to the game itself was the fact that the desert was one of the buggiest areas of the game. Seeing as how it required a great deal of driving, I was regularly having to deal with my view getting messed up whenever I brought up the map. As soon as I put it away, my vision would shift toward the top, and the only solution was to bring up the map again and put it away. That isn't as big of a deal as the game freezing or crashing, but it was annoying to deal with. It'd be like trying to watch a movie and having someone interrupt you by asking questions as it's playing out. I like to think that being a patient gamer makes it so that issues such as these just aren't a problem for me, but I guess that's not always true. By this point, I've made it clear that I had numerous issues with Metro Exodus. It's to the point where I think that it's my least favorite Metro game, but at the same time, there were plenty of moments of greatness where I was reminded of why Metro 2033 made me a fan in the first place. Seeing as how I'm not aware of the thought process that went into making this game, and that I'm only capable of judging this based on what I got to play, but Metro Exodus getting to the roots of the series really made me happy. To some, relying on nostalgia to please fans of a game or any other piece of media is a cheap tactic, but I'd say it ultimately depends on how that's utilized. When I first made it to the Dead City, I knew I was in for a hell of a ride. Not only was it an incredibly bleak place and drastically different from the earlier areas of the game, the music/overall sounds helped create an incredibly haunting atmosphere. I'm sure that some may have been disappointed to see that the game would end in another Metro, but when I realized that was happening, my interest in what was to come shot up. Simply put, I really love encountering paranormal elements in these games. As I said before, it's because it helps differentiate Metro from other FPS games. I'd say that it also has to do with the fact that I'm not regularly playing games that feature ghosts or other paranormal entities, so when I do, and it's done right, I'm left feeling ecstatic. It's kind of how some people get a thrill from watching horror movies and being scared. This part of Metro Exodus was so great that it made me forget that I was most likely heading towards getting the bad ending. That caught me off guard because I thought I was doing a good job in avoiding unnecessary kills, but I guess I was wrong. I'm sure that it didn't help that I tended to go overboard whenever I was seen while sneaking around, and that happened more often than I wanted it to. It's nice that Metro Exodus would drop signs that you were heading towards getting the bad ending, but I'm not sure if it was done simply to offer something different when it comes to the story it had to tell, or if it was a sort of warning sign in an attempt to get you to change your playstyle. I noticed this when Olga, one of the villagers, called me a murderer and Alyosha was badly wounded. I definitely did feel bad about this, but at the same time, if I happened to end up in a combat situation where I couldn't rely on non-lethal tactics, I did what I had to do. This definitely adds to the game's replay value, but I don't think that I'll be replaying Metro Exodus as I already have with 2033 and Last Light. What I did like about the ending I got was that it offered more of the paranormal elements that I've grown to love. I'm sure that the good ending also featured this, even if to a lesser extent, but I was still happy with what ended up happening. I thought that the depiction of the afterlife was great. And I also liked how Khan was added in. That was a nice surprise, even if also a grim one as a result of what that represented. Part of me was hoping that the light that Miller saw on the train would lead to them waking up after having a near-death experience, but I'm sure that's the case in the good ending, even if only for Artyom. Metro Exodus wasn't a bad game, but at the same time, it didn't deliver in the way that I was hoping for. It's possible that my initial expectations of it made it so that anything less than true perfection would make it seem as some sort of lesser experience, but I'd say that it has more to do with how certain parts of the game just didn't gel with me. There were moments of greatness, such as the last third of the game, but it wasn't enough to make up for its earlier parts. If anything, I would have preferred if the blind gorillas had been used from the start of the Dead City. It's possible that there's a lore explanation as to why this was the only part of the game to feature gorillas, but this ended up reminding me of how The Last of Us Part 2 added new and great stuff late into the game. Not only did Exodus do this with the addition of the gorillas, but also with the more hands-on approach when it came to some of the cutscenes that took place in the Dead City. Bottom line, Metro Exodus left me wanting to replay the first two games with high-quality graphics mods. I know that the remasters exist, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are higher quality graphics mods out there. Don't take this as a knock on Metro Exodus visuals. It's a great looking game, but I'm still left thinking that it wasn't as well balanced of an experience as the first two Metro games. In some ways it's better, but at the same time, in some ways it's worse. If you're a Metro fan, I'd say that this is a game worth playing and judging for yourself. Seeing as how I bought this game on sale, I recommend that you do the same. If I were to sum up what I think of Metro Exodus, I'd say that in attempting to take the franchise into new territories, it caused the basics to suffer. I'm sure that some will disagree with me, but it is what it is. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.